allow me? Or
Oh, please,
are you frightened of throwing it on?
No. I'll definitely need some of that. Thank you.
Fantastically deep chairs. We're
Exactly.
I'm going to perch.
I think you might need to turn around to be able to look at the images.
Yes, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Unless there's a monitor.
I don't think there is. No.
I'll tell you what, I can look at them on your screen.
Oh, yeah,
if you
yeah.
can
Okay,
turn
yeah,
just a tiny
there we go.
bit,
Yeah.
does that bother you?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Do that, and then I can happily do that. Also, I've got the book right in front of me.
Cool.
So don't worry for a second. I'm cool.
Yep.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Before I hand you over, could I just remind you to turn your phones to silent? And afterwards, when we get to the Q&A, if you wait till the microphone comes around, because we are filming and streaming live tonight, so for our online audience. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to Francis Hodgson and Jason Larkin.
Thanks. Go ahead. Yeah, okay. Hi, guys. Thanks very much for coming. I guess we'll just go straight into the presentation. Yeah. I mean, do you want me to do a little introduction? Or I've been a photographer for about 6 years. I was based in Cairo for 3 years. I did a publication called Cairo Divided, and I was then in Johannesburg for a couple of years, and I've just moved back to England. And yeah, this presentation is going to be just about the body of work that I did in South Africa called Tales from the City of Gold. The book was published late last year. And so, yeah, I'm just going to go through the images, talk you through sort of the process, the history, my sort of approach, my ideas behind the work, and also then the publishing side of it. Conversation going on about the work and audiences and publishing and all sorts of things to do with photography. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy it. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a brief introduction. I'm sorry about the images as well. The projector's a little old, so they're all a bit yellow, but you can see the book and things there a little bit different. But so I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to Johannesburg. Johannesburg only exists because of a gold reef that was found in 1886, just underneath the surface. Before it was just a very small, sort of small holdings of farm plots, and this gold reef that was discovered then created one of the world's biggest gold rushes, kind of like mining rushes up until that point. And then since that, for about 120 years, that gold reef has managed to provide the world with 1/3 of the world's total gold that's ever been mined. So it was a huge industry. Within just a few decades, there were a couple of million people in Johannesburg, and now the city is 8 million people. So that city only exists because of the mining, because of the gold that was found underneath it. Now it's obviously a very different story. It's a financial capital of Southern Africa, a very important city within South Africa. So I first came across, I didn't have any connection to South Africa before I visited there in 2010. I was there. My girlfriend had a contract for a few months. I followed her down. It was during the World Cup. I'm an editorial photographer. That's a big part of my background. And so I was doing commissions during the World Cup. And then, and you can't go to Johannesburg without seeing these mine dumps. So I started exploring them. And just to give you an idea of what mine dumps are, because, I mean, slag heaps is what they're called in England. And the official name is actually tailings dams. Within the sort of mining speak. But mine dumps are, they're detritus. They are the rock that is dug up from underground, it's brought to the surface, it is crushed very finely. I mean, the top surface, the stuff that the ore is not part of, is sort of taken off and removed and put elsewhere. But all these mine dumps that I've focused on are the result of that rock being crushed very fine and put through an extraction process. It's quite a highly toxic extraction process to remove the gold from. And then, yeah, you sort of like, I mean, it's acids and cyanides and all sorts of kind of nasty chemicals involved in the process. And so what we're looking at, and what I was looking at for 2 years, was purely the remains of this industry that is literally scattered around. There's about over 250 mine dumps when I started this project, and they contained about 6 billion tons of mine waste. So for me, I realized it was a pretty big project. I kind of enjoy those because of the scale of how many sites there are. I mean, looking at anything within a legacy, it shouldn't be taken lightly. And I realized how much these mine dumps are sort of interwoven into what South Africa is today, and especially what Johannesburg is. And they obviously are so visual. They're this sort of incongruous kind of remains of this bygone period. The big thing that struck me was the fact that they're white and yellow, and African soil is predominantly sort of dark and brown and red. So the colours are incredibly striking. But thinking about all the different ways that I could approach it, there were 3 areas that I found. And the first one was communities. There are around 2 million people that live around or on mining sites, old mining sites within Johannesburg. And about 400,000 of those live directly on mine dumps. So that's obviously something you just cannot ignore. That's a real situation. It's a reality for a huge amount of Johannesburg. You know, the lives are so sort of intertwined. So, and there's also different ways in which life in Johannesburg sort of intersects with these mine dumps. There's a formal sort of realm to it, and there's an informal. So a space like this is an informal, but it actually was a formal space. This mine dump was owned by a construction company, and they had their warehouse there, their storage warehouse. So this is only about 1 kilometre from downtown Johannesburg, which you can see in the background. And then when the construction company moved on and got other land, some of the workers that were actually moved there during the hostile riots in the early 90s carried on living there, and they lived there, you know, without permission in sort of shacks. There's about 20 families, and those dogs in the previous image are also living on that mine dump. So the other area that I found to be of a big concern, and it is with mining all across the world, is the environmental impact of it. And these mine dumps, although they sort of sit dormantly, they're sort of forgotten, fairly ignored. No one much thinks about them in Johannesburg. They're just a backdrop like a hill would be or a park would be to anybody anywhere else. And for me, I found that really fascinating. You know, there were just these huge spaces, and I don't think many people even know what's really on them, you know, especially when you've got the sort of the northern side of Johannesburg with the sort of rich and the elite, because the gold reef runs from west to east, and all the mining operations were along that belt. So all the mine dumps are very, very close to this belt, and then the sort of rich miners in the early 1900s all moved to the north to be away from their sort of mining operations. So the environmental side has a huge impact on the land, and it's something that isn't, again, discussed that much. As I was explaining earlier, the process of getting the gold out of the earth is highly toxic. There's a lot of heavy metals that are also released when you crush down earth as fine as that. That's just naturally occurring heavy metals in the ground. So when you crush rock down that would normally take, you know, hundreds of thousands of years to create sand on a beach, in 24 hours you're exposing all of this stuff quite quickly. And then you've got high acidity, you've got cyanide, and you've got these other chemicals that are sort of left in these mine dumps. So I decided to look at that. I'm sorry, the images aren't pairing up with what I'm talking about, but this is actually a huge problem just for a couple of months of the year when they have high winds, but hundreds and hundreds of tons of sand are blown across Johannesburg. So that was another issue, and that mainly blows into the communities of Soweto, Dobsonville, the sort of townships that were created. They don't really affect the sort of white suburbs. This is an image that shows, it's called acid mine drainage, and it's a runoff from a mine dump. So basically what's going on, and it's a sort of quiet interaction again, unless you're out there looking for it. It's not something that's going to be completely obvious. And the acid mine drainage is basically being collected when rainwater comes through the mine dump and picks up these heavy metals, as well as you've got groundwater that's rising up. I mean, one of the only reasons that mining could take place on the scale it was because the pumping of water out of the mine shafts, which was vital because the water table is actually quite low, quite high, in Johannesburg, was subsidised by the government. So as soon as that stopped, the water table's been rising up, and this is a really ongoing, huge issue. If you go to mine shafts around Johannesburg, you'll just see water sort of coming out of it. But you've got this sort of top-down and then bottom-up sort of effect with water and acid mine drainage being created. So the mine dumps have been such a sort of huge part of Johannesburg that, like I was saying, there's a formal side to their use. This is showing a commercial rubbish dump that's basically very close to town, to the sort of city centre, and it's owned by a company that takes commercial waste and then just dumps it, and then there's other guys that go through it and then scavenge and collect recyclables. So, you know, there's 3 or 4 mine dumps across the city that have just been turned into waste dumps. There are industries on top of them. There were cinemas on top of them. So there's this sort of like formal interaction that's been happening throughout time. And as the awareness of the environmental side has been coming through, that's been kind of curbed a little bit more and people have been moving away from them. And another thing that comes through with this, the mine dumps of Johannesburg, is the remining of them. And basically during the production, when they were extracting the gold in the early 1900s, their extraction process they knew wasn't as good as it needed to be to get all the gold out of it. So what's happening now is you've got a remining industry happening. A lot of these pictures I've been showing you are sort of like the informal use. It's wide open spaces within close proximity to a lot of communities. So a lot of church groups go and use the mine dumps at the weekends. This is another one of the municipal dumps. This mine dump here, actually, so this is brings me into the remining. This was a huge landmark for Johannesburg. It was called the Top Star Cinema, and I think it was built in the 70s. And so there was a road that was constructed all the way around the mine dump. It was right in the middle. It's Boysons, which is kind of like the industrial area. I guess it would be like Hackney Wick within London. And it was a huge hill, and then you had this cinema on the top of it, which always had adverts on the other side, and up to sort of, I think, 2,000 cars could sit on the top of it and watch movies. And the only reason it was shut down is because the owners of it decided to reprocess this mine dump to take out the remaining gold content. And this mine dump took 3 years to reprocess it. So I caught it just days before the screen fell. And they made $10 million from this mine dump, from the gold that was still left in it. And the mine dump was probably about 60 years old. So you've got this new cycle happening in Johannesburg where as the gold price is so high and there's so many problems within the gold industry, because there is still some gold mining, but it's further out from Johannesburg now in the sort of very deep mine shafts, sort of west and east of Johannesburg. But it makes it's a very cheap process to turn this mine dump into a slurry and then to extract the remaining gold. And with gold prices being as high as they are, it becomes profitable. This is the road that leads up from the city into the Top Star Cinema. So I sort of, as you can see, there's quite a lot of stuff going on within this quite small space, and just within these mine dumps. For me, it was about how to sort of communicate. I think a lot of photographers might have just maybe gone and looked at the environmental side or just at the communities involved. And I decided that I wanted to show a complete picture. I wanted to show the legacy of mining within one space, because again, you could have gone further out. There's mining communities all across South Africa that have been affected, and there's legacies to be investigated, and environmental problems and community problems and social problems. And I thought this backdrop of just these mine dumps, just Johannesburg, was a great way to sort of condense a lot of the issues that are going on within sort of contemporary South Africa in one place. And I decided to do that with both landscape photography, images like this of this unlined acid mine. This is actually supposed to be treated acid mine drainage. So this is, in theory, safe to drink. I think if I'd fallen in, I wouldn't be here. It was that toxic. This is a part of the remining process. They use high-pressured water to blast the mine dump, break it down and turn it into a slurry. And it sort of brings me into thinking about how to approach a project like this, because these spaces are pretty, they're wide open. All the fences that were ever put around them have been stolen, and for the metal. So the mining companies have just given up trying to patrol them, and because they're private spaces. For the most part, I could wander through. I looked through Google Earth to find. A lot of the time I would just drive around, work out how to approach them. Ones where the big communities on, I worked with local NGOs that were doing sort of either health work or environmental work, and so they sort of gave me access to some of the communities and could show me sites of interest. And then to get this side of the story, which I think does bring the project full circle to them now being broken down, and again this sort of mining town making more money out of its mining past, and sort of they're changing the landscape. These huge holes now are appearing all over Johannesburg where these mine dumps once sat. But that took nearly 2 years to get access. So I sort of show this is the sort of very large-scale kind of mechanical process of remining. It's like 24-hour operations, millions of tons of mine dump waste going through a day. This actually is called Dump 20, and it was in the Guinness Book of Records in the 70s for the largest man-made heap in the world. And it was something like, I think, 3 miles squared. And it's taken them 7 years to get to this point, and it'll take them 3 more to finish remining the whole site. And these are sort of like the final weeks of a mine dump. And what's interesting about the remining and the kind of conversations that I had with a lot of people in South Africa involved in the mining industry, involved in the NGOs that sort of work around these issues, a lot of them call themselves, I think it's rehabilitation sort of companies, and so they're rehabilitating the land, and that it does need rehabilitating. It's going to take years for any of this land because it's all unlined, for it to be deemed safe, even for like industry to be operating off it, let alone houses for communities. But the Top Star Cinema photograph that I showed you, that finished in late 2010, and I was back there. I've been back there 3 times in the last year since I left, and it's still exactly the same way it was 3 years ago. So I think the companies that are involved in this are sort of pulling wool over people's face. They just can't get to the point where they want to spend money on actually rehabilitating this land. And a lot of it that's outside of Johannesburg just becomes a problem. So that sort of finishes up on the remining. And then I just quickly sort of go through, I touched on briefly the collaborations that I had to sort of work with in order to get the access. I didn't mention the writer that I worked with. She came on board probably 6 months towards the end. Her name is Mara Cardis Nelson. She had done a lot of work for local newspapers on acid mine drainage and mine dumps, and the sort of legacy of the environmental legacy of mining in South Africa for the Mail and Guardian. And so she joined me on some of the trips and kind of moved around with me. And something that I started to realize when I was sort of getting all this work together, it'd been 2.5 years of shooting, off and on between doing jobs within the region, was, okay, what do I want to do with this now? What I think this is, pretty important. There haven't been that many photographers that looked at it. I mean, David Goldblatt obviously did the seminal On the Mines, I think came out in early 80s or so. So I did this publication with a South African publisher, and we called it After the Mines. And there was a lot of reasons for doing this newspaper format publication. One, and the main one, was to keep the story within South Africa. I knew that a lot of my contacts and the sort of editorial world that I work in was outside of South Africa. And I wanted to make the story as full as I could, keep as much context as I could, which meant Mara's full 4,000-word essay within this publication, and that was also translated to Zulu. And it was one of the first kind of art publications to be bilingual in South Africa. So we got this laid out and made up, and it was great. It was really interesting to bring it back to South Africa, to start. I mean, there was lots of debates, lots of launches, and we used archive material, so talks at universities, and also it's been distributed through communities who live near to the mining. And I've given it out to the NGOs to give out for their different events. It was actually down at the mining in Durban earlier this year. So it's been a really interesting sort of vehicle to show surroundings that a lot of South Africans are very, very common with. They haven't really thought about these mine dumps, and the NGOs out there that are trying to bring awareness aren't getting much traction. The government knows it's a huge problem and just wants to try and forget about it, because if they admit these dumps are toxic, the water that's coming through here is toxic afterwards, it's just, it's millions and millions of rand to sort out. So, yeah, it's been a really interesting process, and one that I was very keen to make happen. And the newspaper print, obviously, it makes it affordable. And from that, the local media outlets, both Zulu, Xhosa, radio, Afrikaans and English, all sort of picked up on it and have talked about it. And it seems that not just because of this at all, but that people are starting to take note of what their surroundings, what's going on with their surroundings, what's happening with all this money that we've made from mining, what does this mean for us, and how are we going to go forward? How are we going to leave our environment? This is the back cover of the Zulu, it's how you start through the Zulu section. And I also was very, very keen to create the work into a book, because I feel this is a story that does have quite a lot of layers to it. And so we took 2,000 words of Mara's essay and compressed it into this, which allows sort of European viewers, because this is where the book was published. It was published in Germany, and it's really sort of a European audience, because getting books into South Africa is very, very expensive. There's tax on books and import tax and everything. So as well as being able to present it on much better quality paper and much better quality sort of production, there was also other sides to the story that I wanted to bring through, and I wanted to delve a little bit more into the archive material, because this work is all above ground, yet it's all surrounded and sort of connected to what's going on, what's happened underground. So I was sort of, how do I make that link? And I had lots of archive images that I'd gone through the Museum of Africa and British Museum. And then I came across a book that was basically the Fanagalo Dictionary and Phrase Book. And Fanagalo, this is the page where so Fanagalo is a command language. It's a pidgin command language that was developed in the late 1800s. And it was purely developed for Western masters, Western businessmen, Western people that ran businesses and mines, to be able to talk to a huge group of people from sort of African descent and with African languages. And I think there's only 2,000 words in this entire sort of pidgin language, and it was then adopted widely by the mining industry. And still today, 70% of mines use this as the main communication. When I've been down under mines, the managers all use Fanagalo. So I decided to put some of the phrases that I found within this book, their direct phrases and their translations at the back, within this. And then also I got an illustrator, sort of someone who works with etchings, plate etchings, to take the archive images and do etchings from them. Again, a process that would have been used a lot within the sort of media industry within the 1900s, within newspapers. So there were these sort of other elements that I felt quite keen to pull through, and I felt the book was a great vehicle for that. So yeah, that's sort of like briefly my reasons between doing these two different publications, and I'm very interested in how this work and how work generally reaches audiences and identifying those audiences. And there's been several exhibitions of the work in South Africa, and yeah, I'm hoping, you know, it's still sort of going on, and people are still reprinting it, and people are writing articles around it and things. So for me, that's a real important side to my work, as much as bringing it to Europe, which makes the story even more poignant because a lot of these companies were British owned. The money came back to London and still does to some degree, not as much, but the influence from the sort of mining industries and hubs in the area are definitely majority European owned. Yeah, I think that's
Well done.
That's it.
Well done. You don't need me at all. My name's Francis Hodgson. I'm a critic of photography. I'm a historian of photography. I've also been a dealer in photographs in my past. Jason, I want to start where you finished. I want to start about audiences. That it seems to me that when you do a project like this, at some level you want to change policy. You want to reach people who've got power. How does one get from the consumption of photographic projects, if you like? There's a lot of people making projects, through the chain which goes publication and then the exhibitions and then the other publication and the wonderful newspaper. How does one get from that to the point where actually people can say, no, we've got to start replanting grass and trees on these dumps. We've got to start making people pay. Because the project, I mean, I asked you the other day, the circulation of something like this is 800 or 900 copies. Photographic books, we all love photographic books. They arrive, they get reviewed, and they kind of disappear. Even very good photographic books don't spread very far. I happen to know that lots of people buy these things and keep them in the cellophane, hoping that you'll sell out of them, they'll be worth more money later. That isn't reaching policymakers. I suppose I ought to say, because I'm interested in environmental photography, I was one of the founders of the Pictet Prize, which is all about the photography of sustainability and development. Clearly, you've made these pictures to get a message to somebody. How do you control who they reach?
I mean, I think it is really tough. I think working with organisations throughout the process makes you understand what is going wrong within this message. And you know, there was another photographer that was working at the same time, and it becomes, I think it's, you know, the style in which you approach the photography. So if you're doing very, very gritty reportage, I think people can, you know, it gets sidelined into a certain space and only sits in that space. And I think people, you know, can sometimes shut down from that. So I think,
isn't that also true of the very self-consciously artistic projects?
Totally.
Get sidelined in another space.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been, you know, personally, my kind of the way that I'd like to explore my photography projects, you know, the aesthetical style of it has influence how I'm heading and where I'm moving, and I think I'm hoping, and it seems to be working, that it does seem to, people are happy for it to be in a gallery, to be published in a newspaper, to go to a magazine, to go into a book, you know, to be used within NGOs, you know, PowerPoint presentations. That sort of like the beauty that can linger there within something that seems so destructive.
In my language, that's called cross-fertilization. When we see young photographers, we say, you must do that.
Yeah.
You must get one, and time it so that the private view of the exhibition happens on the same day as the magazine public. But does that not begin to make closed circuits where people who are interested in photography get to see this, you acquire a position in photography, but that's very different to a position in the politics of mind dumps?
I think it's about holding what you've just done as much as you can for as long as you can, and kind of, working with other people. You have to work with other people. It's impossible for me. It's hard work just shooting all of this kind of on my own, funding it myself. But working with, I was lucky. The newspaper publisher in South Africa was also a lecturer at Wits, and so we did talks at Wits. They also had connections at Mining in Durban. The NGOs that I've been working with were very complimentary about it. Really wanted to help. They passed it on to other media outlets that would come and interview them from outside South Africa. They took it to union meetings. It's gone there. So I guess it's one of these things of, I don't know exactly how people respond to it. I don't know if it means that, the government will now make companies spend the 10% that they're supposed to on the environmental kind of rehabilitation of this land, of all the profits they've made throughout their whole career happening. I think there are points to me where I think I should just be an activist and go out there, because I can see where the NGOs are getting it wrong, and there's not one voice. They're all kind of screaming from different positions.
But there used to be a position, in shorthand, and it's quite a shorthand, where activist photography was powered by anger, that people wanted to change one thing, and the project never stopped. One thinks of Gene Smith, in Pittsburgh, incredible pictures, but basically he turned himself from being a sentient reporter to being an alcoholic in 10 years of not giving up.
Yeah.
At some point, a project like this in a photographer's career is over. The project is finished. You want to go to Cairo, you want to go to Congo, you just told me. There has to be a point where you can't devote. And yet, the questions that you've raised keep on being a that dust is still blowing into people's soup in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
How does one deal with this as you get older, you've got 3, then 5, then 8 projects, which are all profoundly important to people's lives. And yet, at the same time, you've got, perfectly properly, a career, other curiosities, other drives to take you elsewhere. Does that make you somebody cynical? You've just dropped into somewhere and enhanced your reputation by making these marvellous, marvellous pictures out of somewhere that you've now left?
Yeah.
Or is it that one can only do so much?
Yeah.
How do you feel about
No, it's something
the
that
shift, the
something-
change?
It vexes me sometimes. That my relationship with Cairo was incredibly strong, and then all of a sudden I was in South Africa. Cairo actually became more a personal choice rather than what I wanted to do with work-wise to leave. Relationships, quality of life, all that. You have to at some point. That it's amazing what photographers do for their work and the lengths that they go to. I guess I don't really want to turn into the alcoholic Eugene Smith and be in my darkroom all night and relationships falling to the wayside. But yeah, I do feel the understanding and the kind of all-encompassing approach that I took with this project has given me a huge amount of insight into how to continue within South Africa and continue to looking at the mining. And I have. Every grant I've put in the last 6 to 8 months is all to do with South Africa, and it's actually still within Johannesburg for the most part. So that's something that I feel that I do want to continue on and working very closely with NGOs and doing a very different type of project to this.
Let me ask you something slightly different, which is that as you went through the pictures, you talked about the facts of the place and the problem and the history of the industry. And you didn't much talk about the pictures themselves. Now, it's an old debate, and clearly both are very important. But as a communicator, your messages are intimately bound into the pictures.
Yeah.
They're also anchored in the underground history that went on in the reef.
Yeah.
You make pictures in a very beautiful, very poised, rather slow, very steady way, which is about allowing the land to have its own say. that doesn't sit all that easily, apparently, with a history of exploitation, a history of protest, a history of get rich quick. There's a kind of shift, it seems to me, between the way you've chosen to express yourself and what you've chosen to express. You're quite right that if it were stylish black and white of the 1960s, a lot of people would just switch off. Is that something where you think audiences are literate enough to follow these chicanes of photographic taste and history and stuff? Do it the old-fashioned way.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think the topic is fairly complex. I think even when I was showing editors at a place like Perpignan, you had like sort of 30 minutes and, talking through the story. They would just be like, what are we looking at? What's going on here? So that was the sort of impetus. I don't think this type of presentation in South Africa, this type of presentation in South Africa has not gone through what is a mine dump. How does the mining industry work? And sort of Johannesburg's relationship to mining. It's not needed, but I don't know what people here know about Johannesburg. So, and it has been more to do with what's going on in specific pictures. There are relationships with the people in these pictures for South Africans, which can become much more sort of complex as well. So it's sort of like, what's going on here? Why have you only just labelled this Sam? Do you not know his surname? Why have you use the word coloured girls here in this? There's been some really interesting sort of debates around that. So I think, I'm happy to go into each picture. I mean, I think the thing with the way that I like to approach things, there's multiple stories going on with all of this. I could have followed, the religious side of the way these mine dumps are being used, just exclusively. I mean, in the background of one of these photos is Ponty. Ponty Tower is what Mikhail Sobotsky, and he just went in and he just stayed there, and that was it. The mine dumps, I felt, were like a fairly sort of a sphere to work within, but still so huge. 400,000 people living on them. Like, where do you? So I don't want to get too lost on one person's story, one person's narrative within these pictures. And I feel that when I'm working, I want to be able to show there's all this going on. I also don't really want to show too much of the way that I personally feel about it. I mean, I think it comes across, but I'm laying out the facts. If people turn around and say mining's disgusting, mining should never have happened, so be it. I don't agree with that. The writer, she was very, very anti sort of capitalism and anti mining, and we had to sort of tone it down because I felt that's not what I want to put across here. It's a legacy. How do we deal with this legacy? It happened. We're doing it now. Like, how can we look at this? And it's a legacy of the complexity within South Africa, and it's one of the most complex countries I've ever been. So,
can I ask you just briefly, I guess, about the way you work? That I'm increasingly aware that the old trades around photography are beginning to disappear into what I think of as a digital soup. That everybody has one of these, and that if you used to be a specialist in printing or a specialist photographer or a writer or an editor, now it's all done on a Mac, and increasingly people are asking photographers to do everything. So the first thing you've already answered is clearly you have shows, you have rougher copies of prints being seen in newspapers and finer copies of things being done by Steidl. Of course, I understand the pictures themselves have different weights. But are you beginning to be asked to make video, to interview people, to come back with some kind of quick journalism as well as with these much slower stories? Are you beginning to find the pressure is on you to be a content supplier for all aspects of that great digital sucking up of content? Or are you resisting that?
I am resisting it. I actually sort of had a second life, previous life in multimedia, in video, so I sort of understand that. I'm not that excited to move into it right now. I don't know where things will go, but I have been asked to do one film on quite a long commission, and I just didn't really enjoy it. I don't enjoy multitasking. I guess the point to these sort of personal projects, in a way, as much as involved in and sort of you really want to get to the bottom of, and you have this curiosity that just takes over, and you move to that country and you embed yourself, kind of thing. There is also sort of like a purity that I want to get to with my own artistic kind of output, and in terms of this is what I want it to be. You know, I do feel that book is kind of the best it could, you know, and that's a great feeling.
So once the book is done, is the project done?
Well, yeah, this part of the project, there will hopefully be an acid mine drainage part, but that's much more focused on sort of working with NGOs. It's actually about really sort of communicating the issues around South Africa. It's not, I don't think it's something that would take for as long a period as what I've done with this. It's going to be something that's much more focused in certain areas.
Just walk us through, because I'm sure people don't necessarily know. How do you finance such a thing? Was there a customer for this? Did you go yourself? Did you raise money from private sources and then find the customers later?
Yeah.
Just kind of in a sketch.
Well, it's a kind of...
Tell us how I mean, this is a complicated and long-standing, very elegant project. Was it paid for by the publisher? Was it paid for, you know...
I got one grant whilst I was doing the project, a South African grant, that then put on an exhibition of the work. And I was really lucky to get that because a lot of what's going on within the arts funding in South Africa is just primarily for South Africans. So for an outsider to get it was a little controversial, but because I was living there and I'd spent so much time on the work, so that was nice. But I actually shot a lot of it by then. So the book is kind of like a hard knock when you realise, oh, we don't just make your book; you have to bring the money.
Yeah.
So once I had the kind of we'll print your book, I was like, oh, but I've got to pay for it. So that was a sort of rude awakening. And then I just started to think how, you know, I spoke to the mining companies. I spoke to one of the companies, the world's biggest mine dump manufacturer. They kind of maintain mine dumps around the world.
Right.
And they were very interested in it, and they sort of, you know, they didn't find the work too problematic in terms of my stance. You know, they could see that I was well versed in it, so I could see all the sides, and it's not just simply black and white. But ultimately, that got kind of canned. And then I, luckily just started speaking. I went down and did a talk at my old university, and Falmouth University came through, which is where I did my BA. So I was really lucky in that respect to manage to get that off because...
Okay, but so in university terms, we know this language, it's a research project. That's what they like to hear. In terms of the book, there's always a problem with photography books, and it isn't by any means restricted to you, which is, of course, you get kudos and respect in the photographic world for having books out. In the old style, some publisher committed his company's money and his judgment and his reputation, it was always a man, to your project. If you pay for it yourself, it looks like that approbation has taken place. But of course it's close to vanity publishing. Not a word that photographers like to hear, but
No,
so there's a really complex thing between you need to have a validated publishing track record behind you, but you're being asked to pay for it yourself. These are very slippery moral questions which I'm not sure the recipients of photographs are quite aware of.
Yeah.
It used to be that, you know, Victor Gollancz would publish your thriller in 1930-something and you were a thriller writer. Now, you produce a photographic book, it sells very few copies, poetry book, brand new, unknown poet might expect to sell 3,000 copies of a book if they're lucky. Photography books are selling 1,000 copies at a time. So there's a way in which this relationship with that market is getting you approbation, which then comes back into, I know you work through a photographic agency. I'm sure there are individual projects you do editorially where your price goes up because your status has gone up. And this complicated dance between financing, self-financing, short job, long job, career job, seems to me to be very, very ticklish to negotiate for you, but also for the people receiving your messages who don't quite know necessarily where to situate you.
I mean, it's incredibly exhausting.
Yeah.
And it's a really hard, you know, you think about sort of going to universities and telling students, well, how do I do this? And then how do you do that? And
People
there
don't
is
know.
no, you know, one way, there's no rhyme or reason sometimes to the way things sort of progress. I guess, you know, it's all pretty much down to me. I mean, to some part, I haven't really, you know, it's great when people receive it well and say, yeah, we'd really like to do something with this. But, you know, going to somebody and saying, I'd like to do this project, and then getting funding and saying, yeah, we'll put a show on, and they haven't even seen it.
Doesn't work like that.
You know, there's very few people that can kind of exist with that sort of in that comfort zone, I guess, you know. And so, you know, I think doing the Cairo Divided newspaper, you know, thinking, you know, I wasn't very happy with, not very happy. I liked the publications, the magazines that used that work, but I still felt the context was stripped out of it. You know, I was watching the revolution from afar. I felt like the media was losing loads of context, you know, and I knew the place, and I still didn't really kind of understand what was going on. So I sort of just thought, take control of it. You know, you do something you want with this story, and self-publishing is not new. It's not that inventive a thing to do. But yeah, I guess doing it in Arabic, you know, making it a newspaper, sending it out, giving it to organisations all over the world. You know, the PhD organizer, you know, everybody. It was so interesting thinking about, well, who is going to sort of change this? Who can actually sort out what the you know, these buildings around Cairo? Who can help these money? And so it takes you into this, and the newspaper is a good vehicle for that. You know, it's sort of the brochure of, you know, when I guess the PR company sending things out. You know, this is our new project. This is like, well, this is a reality going on here, and you're the mining guy. And I don't think you've stopped and actually thought about this enough. You know, maybe people still just throw it away because it is a newspaper.
But, I mean, if it should turn out that a mining company or a waste recycling company offered you some money, would those pictures then change in their weight? Would they change in your... If the next bit of this project came because some huge corporation said, yeah, we can use this is going to tidy up our image no end. Does that affect the pictures? Does it affect you? Does it affect us? How does that work?
The reality is, it becomes very complicated then. Mining companies, the people that got me access onto these mine dumps, bought work. Yeah. You know, it's in galleries. Yeah. You can buy this work. They asked me directly. I was amused by the images that they had chosen. You know, they're obviously thinking this is, you know, really beautiful work of our great operations. And to me, I looked at those images and said, you know, the pressurized water, this is a huge amount of waste. You know, this is tons and tons. This is a sort of, like it's got to a water scarcity point in Johannesburg. You know, and for me, that was a little bit of the impetus behind that picture. And it's a very odd scene. But for them, they're like, how beautiful, you know. Yeah. You decide what you want from looking at my images. I'm not going to be didactic to tell you what to think about this image. Yeah, it's, you know, to be honest, I mean, if I'm going into the millions of pounds of earnings, then you may have some sort of like ethical way. Maybe you should not be doing advertising for these mining companies. But right now, you know, it's hard to survive. It's hard to keep this stuff funded. It's really hard to get this stuff off the ground.
Look, we're going to have to throw it open to questions that I hope you can take some questions, but I'd like to say how refreshing it is to hear a photographer with such clarity over the problems that are beyond photography. Making the pictures is actually the easy bit in the end. It's the access and the distribution of pictures that is very problematic, and you've explained both the pictures and your habits with great clarity, and that's a real pleasure to hear. Go ahead, somebody needs to take a deep breath and ask the first question from the audience, please. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, wait for the microphone.
Hello, thanks very much for your briefing. You mentioned the toxic nature of these dumps several times. Did you delve deeper to find out what the effect had been on the human population and whether, you know, what suffering had resulted as a result of the leaching of toxins? Because it didn't seem to really come across. I didn't see anybody there and see the human sort of cause of what this has done to the community.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really tough one actually, and it's one of the reasons why not much is being done, because there isn't. You know, it's very easy to take a community that lives on a mine dump, that basically live in shacks and have very bad. You know, they have very little money. Their food intake is, you know, pretty minimal. There's all sorts of other factors going in. So when they turn around and say, I've got chronic chest pains and chronic coughing and things like that, being able to actually turn around and say, this is because of the mine dust, this is because you live on this toxic soil, is near impossible at the moment. And the money isn't being put into this kind of research. So, you know, the health of, you know, people living in shanty towns all across South Africa and these townships is very worrying. So it's not just the mine dumps; it's general life within these environments. To be honest, you don't see. There's not like people poisoned and from working in like nuclear reactors or that sort of environment. You don't see people on their deathbeds, and there isn't that sort of fallout. But the water side of things is very severe. The lakes that used to be pleasure lakes, completely dead. Farmyards and places where vegetables used to be grown. I don't think the image. There's a guy kneeling down and he's praying before collecting water. He drinks this water that everybody knows is toxic, but he's not ill as yet. But they know it's toxic. That stuff in that water would say that's safe to drink. So it's just sort of like the build-up. I mean, the acid mine drainage is this kind of like slow, scary, unseen thing that's happening kind of underneath. And it could get to those points where all of a sudden where Johannesburg gets its water from dictates how it does business. It dictates the economy of Johannesburg. So it is huge, and it's not something that's I think if people were sort of dropping dead, then there'd be a lot more attention to it. But you don't have any within Africa, within sort of like developing world. A lot of mine dumps are like this. But the company that is based from Johannesburg that does mine dumps across the world, completely different operation. It's lined, it's covered, nothing like this happens. You don't have anything like this in the West, really, nowadays, that's being developed. I mean, just as an example, mine dumps in South Africa are 20th of the cost to run and manage than they are in the rest of the world. So that gives you sort of like a sense of, and it's just about approaching this, it's...
Except in China, where they're another 20th below.
Yeah, probably.
Which is them there. And actually, I mean, a lot of them, I have to tell you, a lot of them are to do with things that we chuck out from the West. That in Johannesburg, it's a specific thing, but a lot of the very dangerous dumping is of computer parts. And there are ships going all around the world carrying computer parts to places where there are no regulations to kill people there. So one has to be quite alert to these things. Thank you, sir. Somebody else, ask us a question, please. Lady at the back. Sorry, beg your pardon. We'll come back in a second.
Thank you. You didn't show us many people on these mine dumps. You said there were 400,000. We didn't get any idea of what their homes look like, where they go to school. You said you inferred, or what the danger is, that they're drinking this water. Is there water? Are they carrying it? Are they pumping it from where? Is it from Johannesburg water supply? We didn't have too much of a human connection with them. That's one thing. The other thing is, surely this is, 2014, we can measure what the different toxins are, and I'm sure different mines have got different toxicities. Did you look at that?
Yeah, I mean...
and another thing, you said that there was a lot of water in the mines, and there is a lot of water. Is that water from the acid going down into that water? Is there still water down in the mine?
So let me try and remember. So the first part, I mean, it's something that, I think a lot of photographers would change their stance, and they would say it's just all about the people. Obviously that's the most important part of it. And I guess that's just, when Cairo divided, there's devoid of people as well. For me, that's just the way that I respond to this environment. The people are important. And there are, if you go through the book, you see the guy, I just talked about the guy praying before collecting the water. If you read the caption, it says that, right? So he's about to collect the water. If you want a picture of him collecting water, I do have it. I didn't feel it was necessary. So for me, there's a sort of visual way that I decide to work with. I don't want to make things quite so obvious sometimes. I think there can be a little poetic, people, the idea that he's praying before collecting water, that's a bit strange. What's the story there? I don't tell you. I mean, there are little bits within the captions that talk about the fact that these religious organisations, they don't have formal buildings, and that's why they're on the mine dumps. And then I think there's a little bit within the essay that explains that the reason people drink religion actually asks them to sort of imbibe fresh water once a week. There are photos with, you know, a sort of a scene where you see the sort of shacks and then the backdrop of the mine dump. So there's like, you know, little clues here and there, but it's not something that because I think if I zoom straight into just the people, you lose the scale, you lose the environmental side of things, you lose the relationship between these mine dumps and the city. So yeah, there's, you know, for me, that's what I enjoy about my photography, and how I enjoy sort of moving around these spaces. And obviously 2.5 years worth of work, there's a huge amount of other material there. There's only 42 images in the book, you know, and that's a really hard thing to come to, but I think, you know, as an experience, I feel like people walk through these dumps when you go through the book. If you just want to stay with the communities, I think there are other photographers that have done that, and you know, you can sort of get that information from there. The second part was
Water.
the water. No, the water is coming up because the water table, I sort of explained, maybe it was a bit confusing, but the only way the mining was actually profitable when it was going on was because the water table is very high there, was that it was, what's it called? It's subsidized. So the government was subsidizing, it's sort of like subsidizing corn production in America. They were subsidizing huge amounts of water having to be pumped out of these mines. As soon as the mines stop, the water table rises again to its natural level. So that's just fresh water rising up. And that's going through all these mine shafts, all these exposed metals, all the sort of other things that they're using down there, and that's being polluted, and the water running through the mine dump. You know, the lakes that I photographed, huge lakes, channels, bright red water. Yeah, I guess, you know.
The third part, just very, very quickly, was measuring the toxicity.
No,
I'm sure it is possible.
tons of reports, loads of reports. I mean, there's photographs done. What were they? They were sort of radioactive scans of the mine dumps. And you see, and I mean, that's what some NGOs even go to. These are radioactive dumps. There's uranium in there that's naturally occurring in the ground, that's exposed and hasn't been taken. Some of these mine dumps are remined for that uranium, but there's uranium mining elsewhere which is much more profitable. So they don't remine these for uranium, so they leave it in there. So there is, you know, a huge amount of information about this. It's, you know, 8 million people live around this. You know, if all of a sudden, I can see why the government haven't turned around and officially said, yes, these mine dumps are radioactive, because then Johannesburg might have to be evacuated. You know, if it was to sort of go with its own constitution and its like environmental framework, which is set up, which is very stringent. That's the other thing. It is a very stringent framework, but South Africa, it's, you know, it's a very corrupt place. I think there's 2 people processing the environmental rehabilitation paperwork for, you know, thousands of companies across South Africa. They've got paperwork like this. There's no interest. It's not profitable.
Lady has been very patient.
Thank you. It's very an interesting story, and I believe you have so many challenges when you take pictures, because you divide yourself between taking the landscape and taking pictures of people and focusing on the profile of the people. But I can understand why you pick the pictures of the landscape, because you want to show the connections between the landscape and the city. I remember the same gold rush happening also in Australia and California, and the government in the California states have some hotspots because in the past, 150 years ago, they used mercury when they do the gold mining. I don't know the story of this city of Johannesburg. Probably you can tell a little bit about that. And the second question is about the gold production from this area, where it goes, and what about the mining from a responsible source and certifications, or recognitions from, of the gold coming from responsible mining site. Thank you.
I mean, I think from my understanding, and I'm not an expert, but mercury was used in the very early days, And then in the early 1900s, cyanide came in, and it was much more efficient. I think it actually came from a Scottish company. I think there were a lot of UK companies that sort of pushed the technology within mining. So yeah, and cyanide is still used to this day, and you know, a huge quantity of it as well is needed to be able to extract this, because it's very, very, very small amounts. It's not like you get big lumps of gold like this. It's, you know, especially when you're dealing with a mine dump, so it's already been ground very, very fine. You still got gold within certain ores, pyrites basically, that you have to take out. So the amount of chemicals is phenomenal. Sustainable mining, I mean, I don't know. I sort of, you know, used to read, like, go through mining journals. I don't know if it exists anywhere. I don't know if there's anybody that. I'm sure there are companies, you know, places like Australia, Russia. I can't imagine. You know, I don't know. I don't know enough about mining around the world. But I think just getting to a point within most countries where you're going into, you kind of leave it fairly similar. Obviously, there's gaping holes underground. You know, there's rocks that's all been crushed up. You know, the ecology of the place is going to change in some way. But leaving it so it even looks fairly similar would be a great starting point. I don't think mining companies are anywhere near
And
to close.
And you have to say that sustainable mining sounds like a contradiction in terms. I mean,
Yeah,
if you're
yeah.
taking away raw materials,
What are you putting back?
You know, what are you putting back?
Yeah.
The question I want to ask you on that line is there illegal mining?
Yeah, so
Like there's illegal mining for diamonds all over West Africa.
Yeah. There was actually something just in the last couple of weeks. I saw some reports of 8 illegal miners, that was a real mining operation. But there are a lot of so these disused mine shafts guys get into and then actually operate. I mean, this is a crazy story, and no one's ever really got photographs of it, but they're illegal miners that go into operating mine shafts, because you work on certain shafts at different points in your production sort of schedule, and they go down into ones that have sort of been left to, I don't know, whatever, and then they'll live down there. Some of these guys, they don't see sun for like 3 months.
This is for diamonds?
No, this is all.
I know in diamonds it's very
Yeah,
common, but
yeah.
I imagine
I
there's
don't
more
think-
machinery to get gold out.
No, because you can see. I mean, when I went down into a mine recently, you just see the reef like this.
Right.
So you know, there's still billions of dollars worth of gold underneath Johannesburg. It's just too expensive to get it.
get it out.
It's, you know, Johannesburg is not an attractive place to mine anymore because of the unions, because of the powers with the unions and the employee strife. And they're old mine shafts, so they're very expensive to kind of rejig for modern day mining, which is safer. You know, the air conditioning, I mean, you're talking 2-3 miles deep. So there's a lot of expenses involved. And I mean, this is the thing with capitalist system, right? Yeah. It's not about we need gold because our chips need it. It's like, it's not profitable, we're not going to do it. So it just comes down to that. And that's why the remining of these mine dumps is huge and has become kind of the new big kind of gold boom.
Somebody else. Yes, sir.
Is the square format an purely aesthetic choice? Is there some other thing going on that you shoot in square all the time?
Yeah. Square is just something I started with during my MA. Someone lent me a Hasselblad. I shot a project on it.
Kept the Hasselblad.
Yeah, no, I actually came back from India with it and gave it back. But yeah, it sort of transformed the way that I work, because up until that point I'd been doing everything digital. It was the sort of, I guess, early days. I can't remember what digital camera I had during that period. Yeah, and it just slowed me down. So it's more about film than the square. The square is just something that I seem to work okay within. I enjoyed, you know, the way that it sort of framed it up sometimes, and the pictures. I now do some projects on 6.7 and some 6.6. So it was more about the. There's a quality definitely that comes through film. It's also a real hassle, very expensive. So it's, you know, there's points where I'd love to sort of push it aside, but I keep on coming back to it.
I'd just like to say I think the photos are very beautiful, and I admire the fact that you've gone to a place and it's almost it feels like perhaps the audience, or it feels like people have expected you to take a certain photograph, maybe of pain, maybe of strife and the effects, but you've taken something different and it's turned out very beautiful. I was just wondering what your influences were, and just in general, but also for this project.
No, it's a good question, and thank you as well. It's nice comments. I guess I don't think too much about my influences whilst I'm shooting. There are definitely scenes I come across and I'm like, oh, that really reminds me of a certain picture, or, you know, and that can be a sort of strange feeling, and you don't know whether it will make it into the edit or it'll actually come out like that. But I guess this background and this sort of slower approach, you know, someone really comes to mind is Simon Norfolk. You know, I remember seeing his Afghanistan book when I had left my BA, but I was working in multimedia in London. So and I kind of kept an eye on it, and then I came across that work at the Hereford Festival, and I got the book. And all of a sudden, you know, and I'd always been interested in documentary, but I was just like, this says so much more than any reportage, any kind of, you know, serious, gritty, you know, in-your-face kind of photojournalism that I've seen from Afghanistan. And I got the sort of history, and I got the legacy, and I got all these different layers coming through in a very beautiful way, you know, in a way that I'd be like, and I did. I think I even bid on one of his photographs at the festival. And so, yeah, there was a sort of strange response and reaction, and I think it's something that's just sort of, yeah, really sort of carried on through my work. I think you don't have to do pain and, you know, crying and all the other stuff that I think happens within my industry to get a message across. It obviously doesn't work for everybody. You know, it's hard for picture editors to work out. We really need something that like jumps out. And I'm like, sorry, the guy's about this big, and you know, the landscape, you need to print it this big. But so, you know, it's not for everybody. But I think, yeah, it's something. It's naturally how I see what's going on. It's naturally the way I want to talk about it as well. That's the thing. I want to talk about it. I don't want to just talk about the one person. He was so important. He's so important. Let's talk about him. So let's look at the whole picture.
There's a bigger thing. I mean, it seems to me partly as an answer to what you've just asked, which is a very good question, is that in other cultures than photography, people know roughly the level at which the audience situates itself. And you have a kind of shared cultural... So if you go to the movies, without being a scholar of film, you come out and you have a conversation with your friends about the movies. That's often missing in photography. And photographers feel they have to reinvent the wheel. And it's nice to have a photographer who understands that the audience have a certain level of culture, and that all the kind of normal tools of cultural activity, of quotation, of reference, of allusion, are possible in photography. And then a reasonably well-informed audience gets more out of the things than if you just pretend that you're the first person ever to see a massacre or a mine dump, or, you know. Of course there are previous pictures of mine dumps, and some of this very cool, very beautiful square format, thank you very much, is a way of drawing you to previous pictures that you've seen, even if you can't remember the name or which country the mine was in. And it's a cultural activity like any other. And in some way, I guess I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I feel that too often photography is treated as though it's beyond culture, underneath culture. And I don't think it is. I think pictures respond to analysis in exactly the same way as pop songs or novels or plays or poems. And it's important to try and hang on to the idea that here's somebody who can't make pictures in the money of 1970, because we've seen those. And now it's... Is that putting something into your mouth that you wouldn't have said? I mean, I believe that stuff. I believe that audiences need to exercise the same cultural memory and cultural analysis in photography as they do in anything else. Which is not to say everybody has to know everybody's dates or, you know. You don't have to be a scholar, but you do have to be engaged. But that's my thought. I hope it's your thought too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting one. I do think, you know, there are some photography projects out there, and it's really sad that they're not getting into, you know, media like Guardian Weekend that reaches 800,000 people.
Well, but there are also hundreds of photography projects out there which shouldn't be reaching 800,000.
Totally. So yeah,
we know that. But we're drowning in that stuff.
Yeah. So you can understand why some things don't get into this though, because the readers maybe aren't going to be ready for this. It's the sort of aesthetic and the visual language hasn't sort of more. It slowly sort of builds up to, okay, this is the style now. You know, when I when I first came out photography, what was the style in magazines? It's very different to now, and it's this slow change in the way that portraits are done or the way that reportage is put through.
Well, okay, but then does that hinder you getting messages across, or does it help you?
I mean, I think it helps to, for me, the main. I want to be I want to feel happy with what I've done, and I want it to feel sort of concise and very there's a thread that runs throughout the whole body, even if they do change and they move around between landscape. It's got my kind of stamp on it. For me, that's really important.
You've done that.
I don't want
we'd
the
all
body
agree
to be
you've
like,
done it
whose photo is this? Is this an archive image? What's going on here?
Yeah.
It is problematic. I do think I've sort of pushed myself out into the wilderness a little bit. This is the work that I want to celebrate the most. But commercially, it's not, and even editorially, it's not, the picture editors, I just had a meeting yesterday. The art director wants to see what he's going to get. Yep. You're not going to get this because this is 2 years worth of work. Yep. If you give me a 3-week assignment, I'll get slightly close to it. No one's giving 3-week assignments. Yep. What are you going to do in a day? Okay, do you want me to put my day stuff up on my website? I'm not really proud of that. Not that I'm not proud of it, but it's not something that I've devoted my time and energy and resources into. So it's a tricky one. It's a really tricky one. And I think that's what's really interesting about the gallery environment, where there is this appreciation, there is this point at which people do reflect, and it obviously doesn't reach as many people, and it obviously sort of excludes people, but I do think the engagement that happens with, even 12, 13 images, and I have an exhibition opening of this work next week, so come along, because they are beautiful, big, and I think you get the sort of the feeling and the sense and the scale through in that sort of work. But I do think when people move into those spaces, they give it time, they'll give it half an hour. And, in a newspaper and a magazine, do they read it? I don't know. Do they flick through? Do they only read the text?
No, they don't.
I don't know.
They don't. You're just part of the endless supply of content into this very hungry machine. Somebody ask another question or we'll start talking between ourselves up here. Go ahead, sir.
So you've talked extensively about having your work in galleries and publishing books and everything. I'd just like to know your thoughts about being a photographer. Do you see your works as journalism or art pieces, i.e. pieces that are exhibited as part of a conversation about the art world in general, in maybe perhaps not in the tradition of classical art, but in terms of modern art? Do you feel you have a responsibility as a photographer to give a journalistic story as well as making a piece of aesthetic art?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's probably bigger than this one answer could be. I mean, I think you just have to look at the way Magnums run now, and I think most of those guys get their money from galleries. They don't, they do editorial commissions, but they don't rely on those, from what I understand. People like Mikhail Sabotsi have never even done an assignment in his life. He's only sold through galleries. So, and the scale and the depth that he can get to in this work, so it's really hard, a sort of balance to strike. I don't intend to make a point of galleries and art world. I don't understand it as well as I do the editorial world. But if people are responding to it, people want to put it on the walls and people want to buy it, great. This is because I don't have to go through the mechanics of, to survive basically in Africa, when I was out there in South Africa, I could survive on a few commissions and I could really run around and do this work much more so than I would here. Here, the costs and everything's just changed. So the way that I have to sort of balance what I'm doing, how much personal work am I going to be able to do? So I'm applying for grants, it changed the sort of way that I'm doing things. Because really the commissions that you're going to get through newspapers and magazines here are just going to pay for you to live. They're not really going to pay for you to really, jump on a plane or go up to the north and do a project.
There's another thing as well, which is that pictures have always shifted as they go into different contexts, long before you were at it. Pictures go very easily from one context to another. And it's quite normal for a picture which has done its editorial role to reappear in a gallery, and a different audience responds to it in a different way. One of the things photography did was that slipperiness. Photography is one of the places we discovered that things can actually move from a museum context to a kind of historical context to a very frightening new activist, you used the word a second ago. And there's nothing surprising about that process taking. What I think is new is that photographers now have to play the game deliberately. Whereas it used to be that you got to be 50 years old, you got a gallery show, and you went from being a photojournalist to being an exhibiting artist with all the problems that involve. Now you're describing very clearly a world in which you have to constantly feed the one budgets that come from the one into the other, and it's quite morally difficult to keep one's balance, and ethically difficult, maybe the better word. But it seems to me that ask any photographer now, and they'll say to you, well, of course, it's both of those things, all of those things, but it depends who I'm talking to and when. Whereas maybe 30 years ago, they would have said, at the moment, I'm working for the Sunday Times magazine, and in 30 years, if I'm lucky, I'll have a show at the Photographers Gallery. Isn't that right? That it's the constant change which is wearing, rather than the fact that you can change from one to the other.
Yeah, I mean, sort of getting your work, if books are important, and I can see why they are important. There's such a great vehicle. I'm doing workshops at the moment at universities about like how you sort of structure your work. Like, what are you going to do with this end body of work that you've gone out and spent lots of time and lots of money on? And who are your audiences? And I think thinking through the vehicles in which you're going to get that work out is as important as what you've been doing and what your idea is. Because, it's great to have a great set of pictures, and if you're only going to show them at portfolio reviews, so thinking about the book allows you to sort of shape it, to finalize it, to go. It's like putting a film together. If you're just making a documentary, you just film forever, and you're making a documentary, but until that film is made, the structure just isn't there, and people are not going to understand how to engage with that. So I can see why people are still focused on books, but then to get the books off the ground, where does the money come from? So that you get back into this.
You've been
debate.
very restrained, by the way. You haven't tried to sell copies of the books right here.
No.
You should.
I'm not allowed to sell copies of the books, but I do have the newspaper, which you can only get in South Africa. So I've got copies here. They're £8. So if anybody's interested, it's the Zulu English newspaper, and I've also got flyers for the exhibition.
I don't see people yawning with boredom yet. I'll take a few more questions. You're right for time, Marion. There's a hand at the back, I think.
I also don't make any money off any of it, so there's no point in me really kind of pushing it out. That's the other weird reality.
But it's not a charitable proposition either.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all right. I was outrageously late, so this may be irrelevant. So you may have already talked about it, or it may just not make any sense. But I was interested in what you were saying about the cultural identity of photography. And it seems to me that it's very different from art in the sense that you have the responsibility because you're showing someone else's story. I don't know how else to explain that. That I'm probably never going to meet the people in your images or see the landscapes in your images, but you bring them to a new audience, and that's slightly different from taking a portrait of someone. No one thinks that they have collective ownership of their own portrait. In fact, they'll often say, well, it doesn't look anything like me. Whereas a photograph, it's you, right? Like it's a representation of you to the world. And I wonder if you feel that responsibility when you take images. And I guess related to that is I went to the National Press Photographer of the Year competition in the South Bank. And to be honest, it was just extraordinarily grim. Like it was literally picture after picture of the most violent, graphic images. And I wanted, as a like to identify as someone who's interested in the world, person to kind of associate with it. But both me and my friends left and looked at penguins after about half an hour. So we just can't handle this level of grotesqueness. And I wonder if there's an art in producing something that's softer as a way of trying to get people on board so that you can kind of show things. Because no one's life is always horrendous and no one's life is always brilliant. And it seems like it completely distances you from that image. Because you think, well, my life is so different from that massacre, I can't relate to them. Whereas the steps in between of how you get to that is actually the much more important message, I think. So I just wondered if there was a choice that you made, or if actually it's just an aesthetic choice.
I mean, I guess the first part I totally agree with. It's... this is a good example. Sam, that's just the title. That's all I got from him. There was a moment, he was just hanging around with his mates, start shooting, and then they just run off. Not because of me, just run off to do something else. I don't know anything about his life. I'm not going to pretend to. I could kind of second guess it because of the community he lives in. And you can do a lot of second guessing when you're to navigate through these sort of spaces, you have to be kind of alert and like, okay, this looks dangerous, or this doesn't, And I think that's, again, why I don't go too deep into what's going on in every picture. Because, some people might not be happy about the way they're portrayed, and they may not be happy. I mean, there were a couple of people in South Africa that had issues with the position that people... There's a guy panning for gold, which is kind of like Mozambican panning for the gold at the mine dump, and they thought it was very derogatory because he was sort of bending down. And it was interesting. It just kicked up a really interesting debate within the school that I was presenting at between the students. And there was a sort of racial thing going on, which is very hard to get away from in South Africa. You know, with that, if I was to say, "Oh, this guy is very, very poor, and this is what he has to do for a living," you know, I don't think it's a bad living. With the amount of money they were earning, they were their own bosses. They worked in their own space. I just left it as a guy that's panning, you know, and there's a lot of them. So yeah, I think there is a huge amount of responsibility, and you know, in a way, I sort of sidestepped that a little bit by looking broader and sort of pulling back a little bit and not focusing in so much. Yeah, and the second part, I you know, couldn't agree more. I guess if you are going to, you know, regions of war and genocide, it's hard to work out how else to get photography from that area that tells you what's going on. I think a lot of the photographers that I am inspired or, you know, influenced or enjoy their work probably look at the aftermath a little bit more. You know, someone like Richard Moss, which divides people very quickly. Really, really interesting way of looking at such a complex issue that no one knows anything about. You know, it's been going on for decades. World doesn't seem to care so much. You know, how do we look at this with sort of fresh eyes? You know, who's going to read the 10,000-word New Yorker article, which will be great and give you all the context? How many people get access to that? I don't know. How many people get access to Richard Moss, you know, installation at the Venice Biennale? You know, so it's. But I feel this sort of aftermath. There's other ways of looking at these subjects that doesn't have to be so grotesque, but can still give you that reaction.
There's a tremendous problem about consumption. I mean, the people who are in charge of the distribution of pictures, acting on our collective behalf, really do think that there's a kind of arms race out there, and that all these words, people have got compassion fatigue is one canting expression. They really do. I mean, your picture editors really do think that if it was a head torn off the other day, it's got to be two heads torn off today. There's a kind of way in which the time spans of the life of photographs is getting shorter and shorter, and people like Jason are fighting back by taking longer and longer, and the projects get slower and slower. But if you look, you know, even in a civilized country, even in a civilized newspaper on a civilized TV screen, the stuff that you're being asked to look at, you know, the World Press Awards are unbelievably violent, and they're gone, except that they're fished out of this soup to win a prize 6 months later. It is a problem, but it is being done in our name. It is being done because we seem to have no attention span for anything more considered than that. And I mean, or we do, but it's marketed in a different place.
I mean, there's a bit of a tangent, but I just went to Alain de Botton, I think you say, his new book, News, and he did a talk at the National Theatre I went to last week. And, you know, fascinating, really, really interesting. And, I agree with a lot of stuff he's saying. And one of the biggest things, I mean, he had real sort of disdain for photojournalism, because he was just like, it's all dead images. All the images that are used in newspapers are illustrating purely what's going on within the text. They add nothing else. There's no deeper sense of what's going on, what's happening behind this story, not even behind this picture. And I thought that was really interesting. And I sort of do feel that with the way that photojournalism is going. And it's not to say the photographers aren't doing things that are really important and do have a lot of depth to them. It's actually, and I hate to say, it's the industry. And it's not just one picture, you know, everybody's following each other. There is a certain way that things should look. And that's a real shame, and I think he's sort of really sort of nailed it. And you know, the power of which the media has, and how little they're giving us sometimes.
I'd actually go even further. I'd say that the trope that we have now is that the pictures tell you the story, and you get it and pass on like a headline. And then if you're interested, you can go and spend a few moments reading the text beyond, which is a reversal of how it used to be. And actually, if you look at people on the tube reading a newspaper, they read the pictures and then they go back again. And if something's stuck or has struck a chord or whatever the phrase is, they will go back again and kind of read the text like a caption, which means that there is actually a space for slower thinking. And I don't know how you pronounce him. De Botton is quite right, but I think he's not quite far enough down our hunger. I mean, people now consume a whole genocide in their morning tube ride. It's in, it's gone, it's forgotten. And if you ask them that evening what they saw in the paper that morning, was it a flood in Somerset, or was it somebody starving, and I can't remember. And it's gone. And that is an industrial process as well as being an artistic or personal process. It's very important. Somebody else, another question. Yes, sir. Sorry, did you want to?
No.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's great.
I know I've asked one before, but I think keeping on that theme, you know, a lot of the photojournalism is trying to make a quick impact to get a situation changed or get a reaction from government or bodies. If it's a serious issue, you can't take pictures that do not show the nub of what's going on, that are quiet in that sort of situation. I mean, we've talked about massacres or whatever. Here, you're looking at. I'm slightly confused by, you know, the main issue seemed to be the toxic nature of this region, but then, you know, we've been looking at beautifully taken photographs and well taken photographs, and I'm not sure how that also sits in with how you've addressed the mine owners and what restrictions they might have put on you in terms of covering the issue. So I'm sort of unnerved a bit about how you're trying to show it and what your eventual message is, what we should walk away with.
But can I answer before you do? Because I want to leap to your defence, is that Jason's already very clearly said he doesn't want to prejudge your potential reaction to the situation. The guy panning, the Mozambican guy panning for gold, is making a good living, and he's being poisoned while he's doing it. Both. So that what the pictures have, and what Jason's patiently explained, is that it's up to you. Using the resources both of your visual culture and, if I can call it that, of your political culture, to come to your conclusion about what's here. The reason I dived in is that no photographer can say that. But I can say that it's not up to him to tell you what to think. It's up to you. And that this feeds in a bit more argument as well as a bit more information, both metaphor and fact, into the culture that you already have. This stuff isn't new to you, but this is taking the debate on a bit further in your internal mechanisms. Now, if I've understood you rightly, you're saying it's not up to you to tell this gentleman what the answer is.
No, I don't believe I should, because I don't like when people tell me what to think. And I think that's what happens with a lot of the way that media's kind of managed nowadays. Think this, like, you're gonna like this because she's got no clothes on, or you're gonna, you know, whatever. And they sort of, I don't know, yeah, there's no space for, how do I believe, you know, I don't think the situation is so black and white. And obviously news, tell us what's going on, but also give us, like, what is your viewpoint as well, you know, a little bit. So I know there's a sort of slight contradictory stance there, but sometimes, I mean, I feel that this is a legacy that has been ignored, forgotten, and life has just carried on, and it needs to be looked at. People need to understand that, you know, people live on these, that people are affected. I don't feel like I need to go to the depths where, I mean, a cow carcass, because I didn't actually come across one, but I know that animals have died because of drinking out of polluted streams. I didn't think, you know, some photojournalists might have gone, that's what I need. That's the image that I really need to put across. And, you know, if I'd seen one and I'd worked out how to photograph it, you know, I probably wouldn't have done it so you saw the flies and the flesh and, you know, a big sort of graphic close-up, which a lot of people would have said, yeah, that's a killer image. That's the image I want. And for me, that becomes a bit problematic with photojournalism sometimes. It's like you've already got an idea of what the narrative is, and you're just out there to sort of reinforce that sense of what you've got. And I think that can happen with the Western take on, you know, Africa. I mean, I've seen people who've made a lot of money out of photographing Africa within my agency turn around and say, I don't think I've helped Africa at all. I think, if anything, I've reinforced the sense of, you know, this is something we can't fix. It's you know, it's broken. You know, the only way they can do things is by us helping them.
But perhaps it helps just to say, I wonder if you would have asked the same question if you'd been talking to somebody who expresses himself in prose. In prose, we expect a kind of balanced position, developed arguments, which are not necessarily conclusive there or there. But somehow in photography, we've been brought up to this thing that it's a one-hit wonder. You get a picture, your guts turn over. And here is somebody who demands the same measured response as he puts in, which is not a one-hit wonder. It's emotionally and, if you like, scientifically or factually or historically loaded enough that, but as I say, had you been asking the question of a prose writer who'd written about these very same circumstances in the same place, I don't think you would have asked the same question, because your expectations would have been of that gentler contribution to an ongoing debate where all sorts of positions and shadings of opinion were possible. That seems to me one of the great glories of photography that's so often missed, is that most photographers have been pushed into this corner where they're expected to say, it says in the caption, dead cow with flies, so we know this man saw a dead cow with flies. And I, for one, and I hope all of us, think that the point is that they can have a more expansive, a wider possible response, which is one of the reasons I'm glad to be sitting here. And so I hope are you all. Jason, thank you very much. It's an illuminating exegesis on the pictures and on your process. I hope you've all enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much for your patience and for some very good questions. Thank you.